The story focuses on one of the most bizarre yet true chapters of American history, the Guano Islands Act of 1856. It is a tale of bird droppings, international diplomacy, and the desperate search for white gold. The White Gold Chronicles, a tale of islands, birds, and the soil. Imagine a time when the most precious substance on Earth wasn't gold, oil, or diamonds, but bird droppings. In the mid-19th century, the United States was a nation on the brink of a quiet catastrophe, one that didn't involve wars or politics, but the very dirt beneath its feet. This is the true story of how the quest for fertilizer led the U.S. to claim dozens of tiny islands across the world, a saga of boring chemistry that changed the map of the world forever. Chapter 1. The Hungry Soil. By the 1840s, the American dream was hitting a literal wall of exhausted Earth. In the states along the eastern seaboard, Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas, the soil was dying. For generations, farmers had planted tobacco, cotton, and corn without resting the land. These plants are heavy feeders, sucking the nitrogen and phosphorus out of the ground like a sponge. The result was a silent crisis. Crops were coming up stunted. The vibrant green of the corn was turning a sickly yellow. Families who had farmed the same plots for a century were packing their wagons and heading west, not just for adventure, but because their ancestral lands could no longer grow enough food to feed a single horse. The science of the time was just beginning to understand why. Chemists like Justus von Liebig were starting to realize that plants needed specific minerals to survive. Without nitrogen, there is no life. But how do you put nitrogen back into millions of acres of depleted soil? The answer came from the unlikeliest of places, the barren, rainless islands off the coast of Peru. Chapter 2. The Peruvian Miracle. For thousands of years, the Chincha Islands off Peru had been the home of millions of seabirds, boobies, cormorants, and pelicans. Because it almost never rains in this region, the birds' droppings, known as guano, did not wash away. Instead, they baked in the sun, piling up in massive sun-hardened mounds that reached heights of over 150 feet. When European explorers, and later American merchants, discovered these mounds, they found a substance that was 20% nitrogen. It was the most potent fertilizer ever found. A single dusting of guano could turn a failing wheat field into a lush, overflowing harvest. Suddenly, guano was white gold. By the early 1950s, the craze hit the United States. Farmers were desperate. They were willing to pay $50 a ton, an astronomical sum at the time, for this super dirt. But there was a problem. Peru held a monopoly. They controlled the islands, and they were charging whatever they wanted. The British, with their massive navy, had secured the best contracts, leaving American farmers at the mercy of foreign prices. Chapter 3. The Guano Islands Act. The desperation in the heartland reached the halls of Congress. In 1856, a piece of legislation was passed that remains one of the most unusual laws in American history, the Guano Islands Act. The law was simple but radical. It stated that any American citizen who discovered an island containing guano, provided it wasn't already claimed by another country or inhabited, could claim that island as a territory appertaining to the United States. Basically, if a sea captain spotted a rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean covered in white bird droppings, he could stick a flag in it and it would technically become part of the USA. This triggered a literal poop rush. Dozens of adventurous and perhaps slightly eccentric sea captains set sail into the vast unknowns of the Pacific and Caribbean. They weren't looking for spices or gold. They were looking for barren, stinking rocks. Chapter 4. Life on the Rocks. To understand how boring yet fascinating this history is, one must imagine the life of a guano miner. These islands, like Baker Island, Jarvis Island, and Howland Island, were tiny specks in the ocean. Most were no more than a few miles wide, with no trees, no fresh water, and a sun that beat down with merciless intensity. The work was grueling. The guano had hardened over centuries into a substance as tough as concrete. Laborers had to pickaxe the mounds, crush the chunks into powder, and haul them in heavy sacks to ships anchored offshore. The dust was the worst part. It caustic, it burned the lungs, stung the eyes, and left a bitter, ammonia-like taste in the mouth that never went away. Miners lived in shacks made of discarded wood, eating salted pork and hardtack, waiting for the next supply ship to arrive. Yet, as boring and repetitive as the work was, it was this very labor that was saving American agriculture. Every sack of dust hauled off a Pacific rock meant more bread on the tables of families in Ohio and New York. Chapter 5. A Global Footprint. The Guano Islands Act led the United States to claim nearly 100 islands. Many of these names are now footnotes in history: Navassa, Midway, Johnston Atoll. At the time, nobody thought about the long-term geopolitical consequences. They were just thinking about the corn crop of 1860. But this boring search for fertilizer was actually the first time the United States expanded its reach beyond the North American continent. It was the birth of the American overseas empire, all built on the foundation of seabird droppings. Midway Atoll, which would later become the site of one of the most important naval battles in World War II, was originally claimed because of its guano deposits. Howland Island, where Amelia Earhart would later disappear, was another guano claim. Chapter 6. The Chemical Turning Point. As the 19th century drew to a close, the guano era began to fade. The massive mounds that had taken thousands of years to accumulate were being stripped bare in just a few decades. Science, however, was catching up. In the early 1900s, German chemists Haber and Bosch developed a way to fix nitrogen directly from the air, the Haber-Bosch process. This invention meant that fertilizer could be manufactured in factories rather than mined from islands. Almost overnight, the white gold lost its value. The islands were abandoned, the shacks crumbled into the salt air, and the birds returned to their quiet rocks, unaware that for 50 years they had been the most important players in the global economy. Why this matters today. Today, many of these islands remain under U.S. jurisdiction as national wildlife refuges. They are sanctuaries for the very birds that created them. When we look at a map of the Pacific and see tiny U.S. territories scattered across the blue, we are looking at the remnants of a time when the world was desperate for a boring miracle of chemistry. It is a reminder that history isn't always made by generals and kings. Sometimes it's made by the humble cormorant and the exhausted farmer, and the slow, steady accumulation of the Earth's natural cycles.
Chapter 7. The Island That Time Forgot, Navassa. To truly understand the boring yet intense reality of the guano era, one must look at Navassa Island. Located in the Caribbean, between Haiti and Jamaica, Navassa is a tiny, pear-shaped plateau of volcanic rock and coral. It has no natural harbor, no beaches, and is surrounded by sheer white cliffs that rise straight out of the turquoise water. In the late 1800s, this silent rock became the site of one of the most significant legal and social dramas in American history. The Navassa Phosphate Company of Baltimore had claimed the island under the Guano Islands Act. They sent hundreds of African-American laborers from Maryland to the island to dig for phosphate rock, another form of guano that had mineralized over thousands of years. Life on Navassa was a study in sensory deprivation and extreme heat. The sun reflected off the white rocks, creating a blinding glare. There was no shade. The workers lived in cramped wooden barracks, and their commute involved climbing rope ladders up the side of 50-foot cliffs every morning. Because there was no fresh water on the island, they relied entirely on ships from Baltimore to bring them water and food. If a ship was late due to a storm, the men simply went thirsty. The boring part of this history lies in the meticulous logs kept by the overseers. They recorded every pound of rock moved, every barrel of water consumed, and every day of idleness. But in 1889, the boredom broke. The workers, pushed to their limit by brutal conditions and cruel overseers, rose up in a riot. This event led to a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case, Jones versus United States.
1890. The court had to decide a seemingly dry question. Does the U.S. Constitution follow the flag to a rock covered in bird droppings? The court eventually ruled that these islands were indeed under U.S. jurisdiction. This boring legal technicality laid the groundwork for how the United States would later govern territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. Chapter 8. The Logistics of the Long Haul. While the miners toiled on the islands, a different kind of slow, methodical labor was happening on the high seas. The transport of guano required a specific type of ship and a very patient type of sailor. Imagine a clipper ship, its sails bleached white by the sun, sitting low in the water. These ships weren't carrying silk or tea, they were carrying thousands of tons of sun-dried bird excrement. The smell was unforgettable. It was a sharp, pungent aroma of ammonia that could be detected by other ships miles away before the guano carrier was even visible on the horizon. Sailors on these poop ships had to be careful. Guano, when damp, can become volatile. It releases heat as it decomposes, and in rare cases, if the cargo shifted or got wet, it could potentially lead to a fire or the release of toxic fumes that could suffocate a crew in their sleep. The voyages were long, often 3 to 4 months from the Central Pacific, around the treacherous Cape Horn at the tip of South America, and back up to the ports of New York or Baltimore. Day after day, the crew saw nothing but the blue-gray expanse of the Atlantic, their clothes permanently stained with a fine yellow dust that seemed to seep into every pore of the ship's wood. This was the boring reality of global trade. Months of silence, the creaking of timber, and the slow, steady movement of fertilizer that would eventually become the bread on an American dinner table. Chapter 9. The Silence of Howland Island. Further west, in the heart of the Pacific, lies Howland Island. Today, it is famous as the place where Amelie Earhart never arrived in 1937. But decades before her flight, Howland was a bustling, albeit tiny, colony of guano seekers. If you were to stand on Howland in 1860, you would see a landscape that felt like the edge of the world. The island is barely 1.5 miles long. There are no trees, only low-lying shrubs and a vast carpet of nesting birds. The sound was a constant, deafening roar of thousands of terns and frigate birds. The American men stationed there were often colonists in name only. Their job was to maintain the claim. They spent their days recording the weather, tracking the movements of birds, and waiting for the horizon to break with the silhouette of a supply ship. To pass the time, they collected shell shells, polished turtle shells, and wrote long, sprawling letters to families they wouldn't see for years. This was the quiet, invisible expansion of America. It wasn't won through grand battles, but through the endurance of lonely men on sandy spits of land, waiting for the birds to finish their work so the humans could begin theirs. Chapter 10. The Great Transition, from guano to ice. As the guano deposits began to thin out toward the end of the 19th century, the American spirit of bizarre commodities didn't disappear, it simply shifted focus. While one group of entrepreneurs were looking for nitrogen in the South Pacific, another group was looking for cold in the ponds of New England. This brings us to the story of the Ice Kings. Before refrigeration, if you lived in a warm climate like the American South, the Caribbean, or even as far away as India, you never saw ice. It was a luxury of the North. A man named Frederick Tudor, often called the Ice King, decided that he could sell the winter. This is perhaps the most boring yet brilliant business model in history. He would wait for the ponds in Massachusetts to freeze over in the winter. Then, using horse-drawn plows with serrated blades, his workers would harvest the ice, cutting it into massive, uniform blocks. The boring detail here is the insulation. How do you ship a block of ice from Boston to Havana, Cuba, or Calcutta, India, without it melting? The answer was sawdust. Sawdust was a waste product of the New England lumber industry. Tudor found that if you packed ice blocks in thick layers of sawdust and stowed them deep in the hold of a ship, the ice would act as its own thermal mass. Even after a 4-month voyage through the sweltering heat of the equator, a ship could arrive in India with 80% of its ice still intact. Chapter 11. The Slow Cool Down. Imagine the scene in a port in British India in 1940. A ship arrives from Boston. The locals watch as massive crystal-clear blocks of New England pond water are hauled out of the hold, still steaming with cold in the tropical humidity. At first, people didn't know what to do with it. Some tried to eat it and got brain freeze, a sensation they had never experienced. Others thought it was a magical stone that would never disappear. But soon, the boring trade of ice changed everything. It allowed for the preservation of meat, the cooling of drinks, and the birth of the American obsession with iced tea and cold water. The ice trade and the guano trade shared a common thread. They were both about moving the natural world from one place where it was waste to another where it was wealth. Whether it was bird droppings or frozen pond water, these commodities required massive amounts of slow, repetitive human labor and the patient crossing of oceans.
Chapter 12. The Chemistry of the Everyday. To bring this back to the soil, we must look at the boring science of the late 19th century. As the guano ran out, the world faced a nitrogen crisis. Scientists predicted that by the 1930s, the world would run out of food because there wasn't enough natural fertilizer left. This led to the Haber-Bosch process, which we mentioned briefly before. But the story of its discovery is a thriller of the mundane. Fritz Haber was a man obsessed with the air. He realized that 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but it's in a form that plants can't use. It's locked. He spent years in a laboratory, adjusting temperatures and pressures, trying to force nitrogen and hydrogen to bond to create ammonia. The equipment was constantly exploding. The pressures required were hundreds of times that of the Earth's atmosphere. When he finally succeeded, he did something that no king or general had ever done. He pulled bread from the air. Today, about 50% of the nitrogen in your body, the very atoms that make up your DNA and muscles, comes from a factory using the Haber-Bosch process. The boring islands of the Pacific were no longer needed. The white gold was now being made in steel vats in Germany and New Jersey. The world moved on, leaving the Guano Islands to fall back into their ancient, silent rhythms. Why the boring details matter. History is often taught as a series of loud bangs, wars, revolutions, and speeches. But the world is actually built on a series of boring whispers. It is built on the thickness of sawdust, the legal status of a coral reef, the percentage of nitrogen in a handful of dust, and the patience of a sailor watching the horizon for 90 days straight. When we look at these facts, they don't demand our excitement. Instead, they invite us to settle into the slow, steady pace of time. They remind us that the world is a complex machine made of very simple, often dusty parts. Chapter 14. The Day of Two Noons. Before the year 1883, time in the United States was a beautifully chaotic, localized affair. If you were to walk into a watchmaker's shop in New York and then travel to Philadelphia, your pocket watch would be wrong by about 5 minutes. This wasn't because your watch was broken, but because every city and town set its clocks by the sun. This was known as local mean time. When the sun reached its highest point in the sky, solar noon, the town's clock tower was set to 12 o'clock. This meant that there were over 300 different local times in the United States. For a farmer, this didn't matter. The sun rose, the cows needed milking, and the harvest followed the seasons, not the minutes. But for the growing network of railroads, this was a logistical nightmare. A train traveling from Washington, D.C. to New York had to pass through dozens of towns, each with its own noon.
a conductor might have to manage a schedule based on 50 different time standards. Imagine the station master at a busy terminal, looking at a wall of clocks. One clock for the house time, one for the train time, and perhaps 3 others for the major cities the line connected to. It was a rhythmic, ticking confusion that governed the early days of American travel. Chapter 15: The White Labyrinth Beneath Detroit. While the world above was busy syncing its watches, a different kind of history was being carved out deep underground. Most people think of Detroit as the Motor City, a landscape of steel and asphalt. But 1,200 feet beneath the streets of Detroit lies a silent, shimmering world, a salt mine. This isn't just a small tunnel. It is a massive, sprawling city of white crystal covering over 1,500 acres. There are over 100 miles of roads carved through solid salt, some of them wide enough for 2 semi-trucks to pass each other. The salt here is the remnant of an ancient sea, the Michigan Basin, that evaporated 400 million years ago. For eons, this vast bed of salt lay undisturbed, a silent white weight beneath the layers of rock and soil. In the early 1900s, miners began to descend into this white labyrinth. The process was slow and methodical. Unlike coal mines, which are dark and dusty, salt mines are bright. The walls sparkle like diamonds when hit by a flashlight. The air is incredibly dry and oddly sterile. Because salt absorbs moisture and kills bacteria, the mine is one of the cleanest places on Earth. Old pieces of equipment left behind in the 1940s look almost new because they haven't rusted in the dry, salty air. Chapter 16: The Logic of the Lick. Why was salt so important that men would dig 1,000 feet under a city for it? Before it was used to melt ice on winter roads, salt was the world's most essential preservative. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the location of salt licks, natural outcroppings of salt, dictated the history of American settlement. Animals, particularly buffalo and deer, would travel hundreds of miles to reach a salt lick. These animals carved traces or paths through the wilderness. Early pioneers followed these animal traces because they were the most efficient routes through the forests. Many of America's modern highways, including parts of the famous Wilderness Road, were originally built over the paths carved by buffalo looking for a salty snack. The boring mineral determined where cities were built. Syracuse, New York was known as the Salt City because its salt springs provided the Union Army with its entire supply during the Civil War. Without salt to preserve meat for the soldiers, the war might have had a very different outcome. Chapter 17: The Erie Canal's Salty Secret. The construction of the Erie Canal, one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century, was largely funded by a tax on salt. The boring white grains were so valuable that the tax revenue from the salt mines in Syracuse paid for nearly half of the canal's construction costs. The canal, in turn, allowed the salt to be shipped cheaply to the rest of the country. This feedback loop of boring infrastructure and boring minerals is what allowed the American Midwest to grow. Imagine a mule-drawn boat moving slowly down the Erie Canal at 4 miles an hour. The cargo? Barrels of salt. The destination? The packing houses of Chicago, where the salt would be used to preserve meat that would eventually feed the factory workers of London and New York. This was a slow, rhythmic cycle of trade that defined the era.
Chapter 18: The Silence of the Mines. Today, if you were to visit the salt mines deep beneath Detroit or beneath the waters of Lake Erie, you would find a world of profound silence. The temperature is a constant 58 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. There is no weather, no wind, and no sound except for the distant hum of a ventilation fan or the slow crunch of salt beneath a boot. The miners who work there describe it as a meditative experience. The boring work of grinding away at a 400-million-year-old seabed has a way of making the concerns of the surface world, the traffic, the news, the ticking of those standard time clocks, seem very far away. When you walk on a salted sidewalk in the winter, you are walking on the remains of a prehistoric ocean brought to the surface by the sheer endurance of human engineering. It is a reminder that the most ordinary things in our lives, the time on our phones, the salt on our fries, are the products of deep, slow, and fascinating historical currents. Chapter 19: The Devil's Rope. If you were to stand in the middle of the American Midwest in 1870, the horizon would look endless. There were no trees, no stone walls, and almost no fences. This was the era of the open range. Millions of cattle roamed freely across the grasslands, guided by cowboys who moved them from Texas to the railheads in Kansas. But there was a problem. As more farmers moved west to claim their 160 acres under the Homestead Act, they needed a way to protect their crops from these roaming herds. In the east, farmers used wooden rails or stone to build fences. But on the Great Plains, there were no stones and very few trees. A wooden fence was a luxury that few could afford. The solution was a boring piece of hardware that would eventually be called the Devil's Rope: barbed wire. In 1874, a man named Joseph Glidden from DeKalb, Illinois, received a patent for a simple design: 2 strands of wire twisted together with sharp barbs held in place at regular intervals. It was cheap, it was light, and most importantly, it worked. A cow that ran into a barbed wire fence once would never try to do it again. Chapter 20: The Death of the Open Range. The introduction of barbed wire was not just a change in farming technology, it was a psychological shift. For the first time, the West could be divided into neat, private squares. The boring act of unrolling a spool of wire and hammering staples into a post spelled the end for the cowboy way of life. The great cattle drives became impossible because the open range was suddenly a maze of sharp metallic boundaries. This led to the fence-cutting bores, where cowboys would ride out at night with wire cutters to restore the paths their ancestors had used for decades. But the wire won. Between 1874 and 1880, the production of barbed wire jumped from 10,000 pounds to over 80 million pounds. The landscape was permanently stitched together. This is a classic example of boring history. A simple metal string changed the sociology of a continent, settled legal definitions of property, and closed the American frontier more effectively than any army ever could. Chapter 21: The Secret Life of the Pencil. Let's transition from the vast plains to something much smaller, something likely sitting on a desk nearby: the lead pencil. The history of the pencil is a masterclass in slow, global logistics. First of all, pencils don't contain lead, they contain graphite. The story began in the 16th century in England, when a massive deposit of pure graphite was discovered after a violent storm uprooted a large tree. The locals found that this black, shining ore was perfect for marking sheep. For centuries, England held a monopoly on pure graphite. It was so valuable that the mines were guarded by the military, and the graphite was transported to London under armed escort. But during the Napoleonic Wars, France could no longer get English graphite. This forced a French scientist named Nicolas Jacques Conté to invent a boring but revolutionary process. He mixed powdered graphite with clay and fired it in a kiln. By changing the ratio of clay to graphite, he could control the hardness of the lead. This is why today we have HB, or number 2 pencils. The H stands for hard, more clay, and the B stands for black, more graphite. Chapter 22: The Cedar Connection. The wood of the pencil is just as important as the core. A pencil needs to be easy to sharpen, but strong enough not to snap. For over a century, the gold standard was eastern red cedar from the forests of Florida and Alabama. This wood was perfect. It had a straight grain, a pleasant smell, and it didn't warp. By the late 1800s, massive pencil mills were built in the American South. The boring rhythm of these mills involved cutting logs into thin slats, carving grooves into them, laying the graphite in, and gluing another slat on top, like a graphite sandwich. However, we used so much red cedar that by the 1910s, the supply was nearly gone. Pencil companies began mining old cedar fence posts and even buying up old barns to recycle the wood. Eventually, the industry shifted to incense cedar from the Sierra Nevada mountains, which is what almost every pencil in the world is made of today. Every time you sharpen a pencil, you are smelling the descendants of trees that survived the gold rush, holding a mineral that was once guarded by the British Army and using a chemical process invented during a French blockade. Chapter 23: The Great Molasses Flood. Sometimes boring industries lead to strange, slow-motion catastrophes. In 1919, in the north end of Boston, there was a massive tank filled with 2.3 million gallons of molasses. Molasses was a staple of the American diet, used for baking, making rum, and industrial alcohol. It was a cold January day. Because of the boring physics of thermal expansion, the steel tank was under immense pressure. Suddenly, the rivets popped. What followed was the Great Molasses Flood. A 25-foot-high wave of dark, sticky syrup surged through the streets at 35 miles per hour. It wasn't like water flooding. Molasses is non-Newtonian. It is thick and heavy. It smashed buildings and overturned freight cars. The boring part was the cleanup. It took weeks. Hundreds of volunteers spent their days scrubbing the streets with salt water and sand. For decades afterwards, residents of Boston claimed that on a hot summer day, you could still smell the faint, sweet scent of molasses rising from the cracks in the pavement. Chapter 24: The History of the Standard Brick. To wrap up this installment, let's look at the most boring object in architecture: the red brick. For thousands of years, bricks were whatever the local claymaker decided they should be. But in the 19th century, as cities like New York and Chicago began to skyrocket, architects needed something predictable. The standard brick was born out of a need for boring math. If every brick is exactly 8 inches by 3.5 by 2.25 inches, a mason can calculate exactly how many bricks are needed for a 10-story building before the first stone is even laid. In the late 1800s, the Hudson River Valley was the brick-making capital of the world. Huge steam-pressed brick machines could churn out thousands of identical blocks per hour. These bricks were loaded onto barges and floated down to Manhattan. If you walk through New York today, you are surrounded by the red clay of the Hudson Valley, shaped by the boring necessity of 19th century standardization. Each brick represents a moment where human efficiency overcame the randomness of nature.
Chapter 25: The Thread Across the Abyss. In the mid-19th century, communication moved at the speed of a sail. If a merchant in New York wanted to know the price of tea in London, he had to write a letter, put it on a ship, and wait weeks for the vessel to cross the Atlantic, and another several weeks for the reply. The world was a vast, disconnected series of islands of information. The idea to change this was, on the surface, incredibly boring. Lay a single copper wire along the floor of the Atlantic Ocean. But the execution was a Herculean task of patience. The man behind it, Cyrus Field, had no experience in telegraphy, but he had an obsession. The technical challenges were immense. The ocean floor was a mystery. No one knew how deep it was or what the terrain looked like. To find out, the U.S. Navy had to perform thousands of deep-sea soundings, a process that involved dropping a heavy lead weight on a miles-long rope and waiting for hours for it to hit the bottom. This resulted in the discovery of the Telegraph Plateau, a relatively flat stretch of the seabed between Newfoundland and Ireland. Chapter 26, The Gutta Percha Miracle. How do you insulate a wire that has to sit in freezing, high-pressure saltwater for decades? The answer came from a tree in Southeast Asia. Scientists discovered gutta percha, a natural latex made from the sap of the Polaquium gutta tree. Unlike rubber, which becomes brittle in the cold, gutta percha stays flexible and is a near-perfect insulator. The boring chemistry of this tree sap made the modern world possible. Thousands of miles of copper wire were coated in layers of this sap, then wrapped in hemp and armored with iron wire. The result was a cable as thick as a man's arm, weighing thousands of tons. Chapter 27, The Great Eastern, the Leviathan of the Seas. To carry this massive weight, the world needed a ship of impossible proportions. Enter the SS Great Eastern, designed by the legendary engineer Isambard Kingdom Brunel. At the time of its launch in 1858, it was 5 times larger than any other ship in the world. It was so big it had to be launched sideways. The interior of the ship was gutted to hold 3 massive circular tanks, into which the cable was carefully coiled by hand. For months, workers sat in the dark holds, slowly looping the wire in perfect circles to ensure it wouldn't tangle when it was paid out into the ocean. In 1866, after several failed attempts and broken cables that were lost to the depths, the Great Eastern finally succeeded. When the first message was sent from Queen Victoria to President James Buchanan, the world shrank instantly. What once took weeks now took minutes. The boring, rhythmic clicking of a telegraph key had finally conquered the Atlantic. Chapter 28, The Postal Service, the Logistics of the Letter. While the telegraph was for the elite, the U.S. Postal Service was the quiet engine of the American heartland. By the 1990s, the USPS was arguably the most complex logistical organization in human history. The boring magic of the post office lay in the railway mail service. In the late 19th century, mail wasn't just transported by train, it was sorted on the train. Specialized post office cars were filled with clerks who worked in a blur of motion as the train sped through the countryside at 60 miles per hour. These clerks had to memorize thousands of post offices and their connections. As the train approached a small town where it didn't even stop, a clerk would use a metal hook to catch a mailbag hanging from a crane beside the tracks. Simultaneously, he would kick out the outgoing bag onto the platform. It was a high-speed, high-stakes ballet of paper and ink. Chapter 29, The Invention of the Zip Code. As the volume of mail grew into the billions, the system began to groan under the weight. This led to one of the most famous boring innovations in history, the zip code, Zone Improvement Plan, introduced in 1963. At first, Americans hated it. They felt like they were being turned into numbers. The post office had to launch a massive PR campaign featuring a cartoon character named Mr. Zip. The boring genius of the 5-digit code was that it allowed for the mechanical sorting of mail. The first 3 digits identified the central processing facility, while the last 2 identified the specific post office. This simple numerical string allowed a letter to travel from a mailbox in rural Maine to a porch in Los Angeles with almost no human eyes ever reading the address until the final mile. Chapter 30, The History of the Shipping Container. To end this chapter on connectivity, we must look at the shipping container. Before 1956, loading a ship was a chaotic manual process. Thousands of individual barrels, sacks, and crates were carried onto ships by longshoremen. It was slow, expensive, and prone to theft. A trucking magnate named Malcolm McLean realized it would be much more efficient to just lift the entire truck trailer onto the ship. He developed the standardized 20-foot and 40-foot steel boxes we see today.
The shipping container is the ultimate boring object. It is just a box. But by standardizing the size, every port in the world could build the same cranes. Every truck could carry the same load, and every ship could stack them like Lego bricks. This boring box reduced the cost of shipping goods by over 90%, effectively creating the modern era of globalization. Your clothes, your phone, and your furniture all exist in your home today because of the humble corrugated steel box. Chapter 31. The War of the Threads. In the early 1800s, if you were a clockmaker or a steam engine mechanic, you lived in a world of frustrating uniqueness. Every bolt and every nut was handmade. If a bolt on your engine broke, you couldn't just go to a hardware store and buy a replacement. You had to find a blacksmith to hand carve a new one to fit that specific unique hole. The boring crisis of the industrial age was incompatibility. There were no standards for how many threads per inch a screw should have or what angle the grooves should be cut at. This changed because of a man named Joseph Whitworth in England and later William Sellers in America. Whitworth spent years measuring thousands of screws. In 1841, he proposed a universal standard, a 55-degree angle for all screw threads. However, American engineers thought the 55-degree angle was too difficult to manufacture. In 1864, William Sellers proposed the Sellers screw thread, which had a 60-degree angle and a flat top and bottom. It was easier to make, more durable, and it became the backbone of American industry. The boring victory of the 60-degree screw allowed the U.S. to mass-produce everything from trains to sewing machines. Without this standardization, the assembly line would have been impossible. Every time you tighten a bolt today, you are participating in a peace treaty signed by engineers 160 years ago. Chapter 32. The Vertical Revolution. The Elevator. For most of human history, the height of a building was limited by the strength of a person's legs. No one wanted to live on the 10th floor if they had to walk 200 stairs every day. Because of this, the penthouse or the top floor was usually the cheapest part of the building, reserved for servants or storage. The elevator changed the boring physics of the city. But the problem wasn't making a platform go up. It was making sure it didn't crash down if the rope snapped. In 1853, at the World's Fair in New York, a man named Elisha Otis performed one of the most famous boring stunts in history. He stood on an elevator platform high above a crowd and ordered an assistant to cut the cable with an axe. The crowd gasped, but the elevator didn't fall. Otis had invented a safety brake, a set of spring-loaded teeth that would pop out and grab the guide rails if the tension in the cable disappeared. This simple safety mechanism turned the architectural world upside down. Suddenly, the top floor became the most valuable spot because it had the best views and was now easily accessible. The elevator didn't just move people, it moved the entire economy of real estate upward, creating the skyscraper and the modern skyline of New York and Chicago.
Chapter 33. The History of the Humidity. Air Conditioning. If the elevator allowed us to build high, air conditioning allowed us to live in places that were previously unbearable. The history of AC is surprisingly boring because it wasn't invented to keep people cool, it was invented to keep paper dry. In 1902, a young engineer named Willis Carrier was working for a printing plant in Brooklyn. In the summer, the humidity was so high that the paper would swell and shrink, making the colors on the printing press misalign. Carrier designed a system that blew air over cold coils to condense the moisture out of the air. He realized as a side effect, the air became much cooler. For decades, AC was an industrial tool used in chocolate factories to keep the candy from melting and tobacco warehouses. It wasn't until the 1920s that it moved into movie palaces. During the hot summer months, movie theaters were the only places where ordinary people could experience manufactured weather. This is why summer blockbusters exist today. People went to the movies in July not just for the film, but for the 70-degree air. Chapter 34. The Concrete Jungle. The Story of Portland Cement.
Underpinning all these skyscrapers and air-conditioned offices is the most boring material on Earth, concrete. Modern concrete is made possible by Portland cement, patented in 1824 by Joseph Aspdin. He called it Portland because it looked like the stone from the Isle of Portland in England. The secret to concrete is a boring chemical reaction called hydration. When you mix cement with water, it doesn't just dry out, the molecules actually bond together to form a new crystalline structure. In the late 19th century, engineers discovered that if you put steel bars inside the concrete, reinforced concrete, you created a material that was strong under both tension, pulling, and compression, pushing. This allowed for the construction of massive dams like the Hoover Dam and the sprawling interstate highway system. Concrete is the most consumed man-made material on the planet. It is so boring that we walk over it every day without a second thought, yet it is the literal foundation of every road, bridge, and basement in the United States. Chapter 35. The invention of the paper bag. Before 1870, paper bags were shaped like envelopes. They couldn't stand up on their own, which made them incredibly annoying for grocers to fill. A woman named Margaret Knight, who worked in a paper bag factory, invented a machine that could fold and glue paper to create a flat, square bottom. A man tried to steal her patent, claiming that a woman could not understand the complexities of the machine. Margaret Knight took her to court, showed her detailed engineering drawings, and won. Her design is almost exactly the same as the brown paper bags we use in grocery stores today. This boring invention made shopping faster, helped the rise of the supermarket, and proved that the most useful inventions are often the ones that solve the smallest, most repetitive problems. Chapter 36. The logistics of the cold chain. In the 1870s, if you lived in New England, you only ate beef that was slaughtered locally. Meat couldn't be shipped long distances because it would spoil. Gustavus Swift changed this by designing a rail car that used blocks of ice, harvested from those New England ponds we talked about earlier, to keep the air cold. He realized it was cheaper to slaughter the cattle in Chicago and ship only the meat east, rather than shipping live, heavy cows on trains. This cold chain required a massive, boring network of icing stations along the railroad tracks. Every few hundred miles, a train would stop and workers would shovel fresh ice into the roof of the car. This system allowed for the first truly national food market. It meant that a person in Boston could eat a steak from a cow raised in Texas and slaughtered in Chicago. Chapter 37. The pallet, the wooden skeleton of the world. If the shipping container is the king of global trade, the wooden pallet is its humble servant. To a casual observer, a pallet is just a few pieces of scrap wood nailed together, but in the world of logistics, it is a masterpiece of boring geometry. Before the 1940s, loading a warehouse was a slow process of finger loading, moving boxes one by one. During World War II, the U.S. military needed to move millions of tons of supplies faster than ever before. They perfected the use of the 48 by 40-inch pallet. This specific size was designed to fit perfectly into railroad cars and the newly invented forklifts. The boring efficiency of the pallet meant that a job that used to take 3 men 8 hours could now be done by one person in 30 minutes. Today, there are estimated 2 billion pallets in the United States alone. They are the invisible floor upon which all our food, electronics, and clothing rest. They are moved, stacked, and recycled in a silent, endless cycle that keeps the world's shelves full. It is the ultimate boring object, so simple we never look at it, yet so essential that without it, the global economy would grind to a halt within days. Chapter 37. The luminescence of the streetlight. As our journey nears an end, imagine the city at night. For centuries, when the sun went down, the world went dark. If you walked through New York in 1750, you carried a lantern or hired a link boy to carry a torch for you. The first boring breakthrough in public safety was gas lighting. In the early 1800s, cities began laying miles of iron pipes beneath the streets to carry coal gas to lamps. These lamps didn't provide much light, just a flickering yellow glow, but they changed the social fabric of the night. People began to stay out later. The nightlife was born. Then came the arc lamp and later the incandescent bulb. The boring detail here is the photocell. In the mid-20th century, we developed a small sensor that could detect the level of sunlight. This meant that no one had to go around turning on the city anymore. As the sun dips below the horizon, millions of streetlights hum to life simultaneously across the continent. The hum of a streetlight is one of the most relaxing sounds of the modern world, a low-frequency vibration that signals the day is over and the world is being watched over by a grid of quiet electric sentinels. Chapter 39: The History of the Sleeping Pill and the Soft Bed. In the 19th century, a mattress was often a sack filled with corn husks, straw, or if you were wealthy, horsehair. These beds were lumpy, itchy, and frequently home to unwanted insects. The boring revolution in sleep came in 1865 with the patent of the coil spring. By using the same physics found in the suspension of a train car, inventors created a bed that could support the human body evenly. In the 1930s, the boring science of chemistry gave us polyurethane foam, and later NASA developed memory foam to help astronauts deal with G-forces. These materials were designed to absorb energy and distribute weight. When you lie down tonight, you are resting on the culmination of centuries of boring chemistry, metallurgy, and ergonomic study. Your comfort is the result of thousands of patents and the slow, steady progress of industrial standards.
Conclusion: the gentle hum of history. As we finish this long story, take a moment to realize that history isn't just a record of loud battles and famous names. It is the story of the salt beneath your feet, the nitrogen in your food, the standard time on your phone, and the soft foam of your pillow. We live in a world made of boring miracles. The stability of our lives is built on a foundation of standardized screws, reliable shipping boxes, and the quiet movement of bird droppings across the ocean a century and a half ago. The great machine of civilization is humming softly in the background. The ships are moving across the Atlantic, the forklifts are lifting the pallets, and the streetlights are glowing with a steady amber light. Everything is in its place. The world is synchronized. The soil is fed. The cargo is secure. There is nothing left to solve tonight. The history of the world has been moving slowly for thousands of years just to reach this moment of quiet. The stories of the past are now just echoes, fading into the rhythmic, peaceful silence of the present. The white gold is gone, the ice has melted into the tea, and the devil's rope has settled into the plains. The giants of industry have done their work, and now it is time for the world to rest. Thanks for watching.